Imagine a world where if you wanted to go from New York to Massachusetts, you had to pay a $50 toll and only use one specific route. This is the U.S. case that changed U.S. commerce laws and the development of the country.
Tick, 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 tick.
The
Tick.
featured show will commence shortly.
Tick, tick, tick.
While the U.S. Constitution already had a commerce clause before this case, it was severely limited in what it could regulate. The original Commerce Clause only dictated that the federal government could regulate the trade of goods across state lines. Anything else was left to the state. This led to many awkward situations, one of which led to this landmark case. The case of Gibbons versus Ogden started in 1798, when the state of New York granted an exclusive license on steamboat navigation within the state of New York for the creation of a steamboat that can navigate up the Hudson River. Soon the two sold their rights to the monopoly between New York to New Jersey trade to a man named Aaron Ogden. A man named Thomas Gibbons was operating upon these waters without the consent of Ogden, and in 1819, Ogden took Gibbons to the state court.
It's a good day to be navigating on the Hudson.
You have a permit for these waters?
I don't.
Well, you're breaking the state law.
Oh yeah? Well, maybe I'll just take this to court.
So, Mr. Stewart, I take it you were quite the expert after studying the martial court cases. Can you tell us a little bit about the Ogden versus Gibbons case?
Well, you never really become an expert with these kinds of things, but I have studied them for quite a few years. In my opinion, the Gibbons versus Ogden case is really one of the landmark cases in U.S. history. It's not quite as flashy as some of the other events in U.S. history, but when you really think about it, it helps make the U.S. one continuous country instead of having lots of disparate cultures. Before this, navigation could be monopolistic, but this basically forced navigation to be under the Bureau of the federal government, which allowed interstate travel to become a lot more easy, and that helps facilitate a sort of universal culture amongst the states.
In the state court, the judge responsible for the case ruled that as the state had granted exclusive rights to operate the Hudson, Ogden was indeed in the right. They thus declared that Gibbons must cease all activity upon the Hudson River and other interstate waters. Feeling that this was unconstitutional, Gibbons had his case taken to the Supreme Court of the United States.
I was given, and won, exclusive rights to operate steamboats in New York.
According to the Constitution, Congress has power over interstate trade. This law is between state lines, therefore unconstitutional.
I rule for Ogden. Gibbons, you must stop all activity in the Hudson River.
Well then, I guess I'll just
Appeal to the Supreme Court.
Mr. Stewart, why do you think the state would allow for such a monopolistic practice?
Well, when you look at the state of New York at this time period, they really had a lot of trouble navigating intrastate waters upstream. So in much the same way that modern states, hire corporations to manage toll roads, the state of New York granted a monopoly to Fulton and Livingston if they had managed to come up with a steamboat that could easily navigate upstream the Hudson. But the problem with that is that lots of sailors and people who wanted to go into other states to the Hudson had to pay really high taxes and fees to the people who owned that monopoly. So when it was taken to the Supreme Court, the federal government decided to take the side of Mr. Gibbons instead of Ogden and open up navigation to everyone and essentially put the navigation under the power of the federal government.
Was one of the cases handled during John Marshall's time as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. During his time in the Supreme Court, he handled many landmark cases and helped expand the power of the federal government, especially that of the judicial branch. In his ruling on the Gibbons versus Ogden court case, he ruled that only Congress could govern interstate trade and navigation.
I appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court because Ogden's actions are unconstitutional and the state of New York does not have the power to give exclusive rights on interstate trade.
According to the Commerce Clause of Section 8 of the Constitution, the Congress shall have the power to regulate trade among the several states.
How dare you? You federal tyrants are just trying to limit my power of the state government.
By unanimous decision, we rule that Gibbons is allowed to operate on the Hudson River between New Jersey and New York.
I knew that I could trust our legal system.
Following the fiery case, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of Gibbons, stating that the state of New York infringed upon the Federal Licensing Act of 1793. The Supreme Court, upon examination of the Commerce Clause within the Constitution, ruled that the meaning of among in the phrase commerce among the several states meant intermingled with. One of the major impacts of the case was that it was the first time that Congress reviewed the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This article of the Constitution greatly expanded the powers of the federal government. Not only did the case grant power to regulate commerce, but it also set the scene for future expansions in the power of Congress. Now Congress had the authority to possibly overturn any state laws about interstate commerce.
Alright folks, that concludes tonight's installments. Tune in next week for another analysis of a martial court case.